Hi guys, this is Weasel for PokerVIP.com. Welcome to this two-part series entitled Defending Blinds Post-Flop. We're going to be looking in particular at how to defend post-flop after we cold call pre-flop from the blinds. It's an area that gives many players a lot of difficulty. We're going to start by looking at some different lines we can take post-flop after we cold call from the blinds, and then we're going to look at some real hand examples in no particular order. And as you watch, you can decide what you do in this particular situation and see how it measures up to what I recommend. Before we get into this, though, what are the main leaks players have when they defend as the cold caller versus a late position open? Although we're primarily going to be talking about post-flop play in this series, the first major problem that players generally have is they're simply defending pre-flop too tight, especially from the big blind. This is partly to do with conventional poker advice, which does in fact tell us that we should defend tight from the blinds, and this was certainly correct many years back. The differences in today's games are players are opening much wider ranges in the first place, whereas 5 years ago perhaps players were opening a 30% range on the button. They're now opening a 48% range on the button, sometimes even 100% range on the button in some cases. The second difference is players are opening a lot smaller, which means we get better pot odds pre-flop, we have to defend more frequently. So as a rough guide, let's say we're in the big blind and we're facing a 2.5x button open. We should probably be roughly cold calling a 30% range in that particular situation, whereas if you filter for that in your tracking software, many players are actually defending more like a 10 or 15% cold call range. Basically means they're losing a lot of money via their red line because they're folding the blind so frequently in situations when they could profitably defend. Moving on to post-flop play, a very common problem at the lower limits especially is giving up too frequently post-flop after we defend from the blinds. So the idea behind expanding our pre-flop range is not simply so that we can give up on a whole ton of flops and play fit or fold post-flop. We're going to be looking for spots to play back frequently post-flop. And if we do this sufficiently often, our fold to c-bet stat in this particular situation, blinds versus a late position open, should definitely be below 40%. Commonly at the lower limits, you see many guys who have fold to c-bets out of position in the blind of over 50%, which is technically exploitable because if we imagine that we're facing a 2/3 pot c-bet from our opponent, so long as it works over 40% of the time, our opponent makes instant profit. So the way we stop him from making automatic profit on his c-bets is by making sure our fold to c-bet is under 40%. However, it's not going to be a good idea for us to then just passively check call the top 60% of hands or more, because this is going to result in us perhaps losing even more money than if we were to play too tight against c-bets. On certain types of flop texture, we want to play very aggressively, particularly the jewelry flops. We want to be looking for spots to check raise out of the blinds once we cold call versus a late position open. So if you're primarily check calling the flop, then check deciding the turn, very often check folding, this can in some cases actually be worse than not defending the blinds frequently enough in the first place. So we definitely want to expand our defending range pre-flop, but we also need to play correctly post-flop, otherwise it can ironically end up making our game worse. A big part of increasing our aggression post-flop is very simply a case of just understanding which lines are possible. There may, for example, be some lines in this video which you've never taken, and if you've never taken them, it means you're probably not even thinking of those lines as an option. So it's going to be much harder for you to defend frequently enough post-flop when you don't have those extra options at your disposal. So let's begin by considering some of these lines. This is the first one, and I suspect this is a line that many of you have never taken in your entire poker career. And it's definitely one of my favorites because even though it's a non-standard line, in my opinion, it should definitely be a standard line, and I would imagine within 1 or 2 years everyone is going to be doing this. It's just that not so many people know about it at this stage. This particular line, check call flop, donk turn, is a type of float. Traditionally, when we're floating after defending from the blinds versus a late position open, the idea is we check call the flop, we wait to see if the turn goes check check, and then if our opponent checks back the turn, then we think about bluffing the river, assuming our hand doesn't improve. The idea of donk betting the turn immediately rather than waiting for the turn to go check check and then lead the river should actually be a much stronger line, and we'll discuss the reasons why shortly. First, let's think about when we'd use this particular line. So we defend from the blinds against a late position open. Firstly, when are we going to be check calling against our opponent's c-bet? Mainly we're going to be check calling on dry textures. In fact, on very dry textures, we probably don't want to have much of a check raising range, if any check raising range at all. So the first thing you should think about when you see a dry texture is any hand that's strong enough to go in your defending range, the majority of the time you're going to be check calling. The next question is, how do we know if a hand is strong enough to defend? What we're essentially looking for is hands that have very good backdoor equity. So things like overcards, backdoor flushes, backdoor straights. These hands are very good to put in our defending range. In order to defend sufficiently often, you will very likely have to expand your idea of what it means to connect with a flop. If your idea of connecting with a flop is making a pair or making two pair or a set, you're probably going to find yourself not defending frequently enough. The way I approach these situations is anytime I have a decent backdoor draw, anytime I have overcards, I feel as if I've connected with the board, i.e. the hand has some kind of potential and I want to continue with that hand. And it's not just about trying to make a hand. In fact, for the most part, it's not about trying to make a hand. It's about finding a profitable opportunity to take the pot away from our opponent on a later street. So look for the backdoor equity, because that's very useful in trying to do so. You might turn something like a flush draw, for example, and it means that your semi-bluffs on the turn are going to be a lot more profitable than it would be if you never turn a flush draw, because you're floating hands with no backdoor equity. A very good situation to donk bet the turn is when you find that your hand has some kind of potential, some kind of equity, so you don't really just want to check fold your hand, but it's a very weak hand to just check call. A good example, maybe something like a gut shot. It's probably not going to be profitable to check call on the turn with a turn gut shot. Probably going to be a losing play in the long run. Depends what you do on the river, of course, so we can't categorically state that it would be a losing play to check call the turn, but generally speaking, it's not going to be that profitable, whereas donking the turn can become very profitable for a few different reasons. Firstly, it takes away our opponent's ability to double barrel bluff the turn. It's less likely he's going to want to continue facing a donk bet. Secondly, we actually have some fold equity, whereas if we just check the turn, we don't have any fold equity whatsoever. And then obviously it's always good if we can continue with a hand that has the chance to make the nuts on the river, because then we can get a big payout on the river. So we have perhaps some implied odds this way as well. So think about donk betting the turn when the hand has some potential but it's not strong enough to check call. This can even be something like ace high, for example, because it still has potential to improve, but we certainly would not be check calling ace high for two streets in most cases facing a double barrel, but it still makes a pretty good bluff hand, because when we think about our opponent's range, he's open raising a late position and he's firing two barrels, he could still potentially have a reasonably wide range. It's very difficult for us to check call against that wide range with ace high, but we may be able to get him to fold by semi-bluffing with a hand that has some kind of potential. So why is this line more effective than the traditional floating line out of position, which is to wait for the turn to go check check and lead the river? I can think of at least two reasons why this is the case. Firstly, we deny our opponent the chance to see a free river. By checking to our opponent on the turn, we're basically giving him complete control over the hand. He's the one that gets to decide whether we both see a free river card or whether he wants to try and deny us seeing a river card by betting. He basically has control over the hand. He has the initiative. By donk betting the turn, we take that from him. We're saying to him, we're not going to let you see a free card. It's not your choice anymore. So one large benefit is we don't allow our opponent to free roll additional equity anytime he so desires. The other advantage is we actually prevent our opponent from bluffing us, because it can be very difficult for us to call a two barrel in some situations, and this is despite the fact we know our opponent could easily be two barrel bluffing us. However, when we lead the turn, he's much less likely to continue bluffing if he has some kind of bluff holding. So we have some fold equity, we take the pot down straight away. Even if sometimes we actually have the best hand with the ace high, we don't mind taking the pot down against a worse hand, because we prevent our opponent from successfully running a bluff on us. Then of course, as the reasons as discussed before, we actually get to see a river with our hand more frequently. If we have something like a gut shot, we get the chance to make the nuts on the river and potentially get a big payout in this case. A final advantage to this line is because it's still considered non-standard in today's games, the regulars are a little bit unsure what to do when facing this line. They're used to seeing their opponent check to them on the turn when they're the pre-flop raiser. So in some cases, because they're not sure exactly what kind of range to assign us, they end up making some big mistakes. And in some cases, they simply just fold a hand that they should probably be continuing with because they're not sure exactly what to make of that play. Okay, so the second line is to check raise the flop and then to barrel the turn and potentially the river also. This line works a little bit better on drawier textures. We don't really want to be check raising dry textures on the flop as discussed. So something like Jack 9-6 with a flush draw is a good example of a board texture where we should be check raising. Again, we want to pick hands with backdoor equity, so things like overcards and a backdoor flush draw, maybe some things like gut shots, backdoor straight draws, anything that has potential to improve on the turn and hopefully make the nuts by the river is going to be a good hand to use as a semi-bluff. As for the turn play, we don't really need to be overly complex about what our strategy is at this stage. Simply, we can just know that we should be barreling on the turn if the card improves us. If it doesn't improve us, then we don't need to worry as much about barreling, although there are some exceptions. For example, it's fine for us to barrel cards that don't improve our opponent if we can identify he has a capped range. For example, if you take that board Jack 9-6, or even if we say Jack 9-7 with a flush draw, and we decide to check raise the flop, if our opponent has something like pocket 9s, pocket jacks, pocket 7s, even something like Jack 9 for top 2 pair, there's a pretty decent chance he's actually going to 3-bet versus our check raise. So when our opponent just calls and doesn't 3-bet, he usually doesn't have any sets in his range, usually doesn't have 2-pair combos. His most likely holdings are going to be some top pair hands, maybe even some of the stronger second pair hands, and then some types of draws as well. On a Jack 9-7 he can have plenty of straight draws, gut shots, etc. So since we can identify our opponent mainly has pairs and draws in his range, let's say the turn card is a complete blank, then it may be a good spot to continue firing, because even though the card hasn't necessarily improved our specific hand, we know also that it hasn't improved our opponent's range, and hence it's going to be very difficult for him to continue calling on turn and river. Line number 3 is the check call flop, check raise turn. So it is okay sometimes to check the turn. We don't necessarily always have to donk bet the turn. Mainly we're going to be check calling the flop because the texture is dry, but this is not always going to be the case. Even though we said we primarily want to check raise drawy textures, it's also true that we are going to have a check calling range on a drawy texture also. The reason for this is that there are some hands in our range that just don't make sense to check raise, but also we can't really check fold these hands. Some examples of these include things like weak top pairs. We obviously don't just want to check fold a weak top pair, but then if we try and check raise that weak top pair, then we're overplaying our hand. Same is true for the stronger second pair hands. Probably don't want to be check raising this, but we don't want to be check folding them either, so it's very good to put these in our check calling range. As a result, we are also going to think about check calling some of our draws as well. And theoretically, we should also occasionally check call some strong hands to protect our range, although it's certainly not a big deal if we never do this at the lower limits, because we're not necessarily going to be exploited for having a capped range when we check call on a drawy texture. So on a dry texture, when we check call a flop, it's going to be often with things like sets, for example, because we're not going to check raise these on the dry texture. And let's say the turn card coordinates the board a little bit, then we're going to go for a check raise with our sets to extract value from our opponent. So let's say instead of a set we have some kind of float with a backdoor flush draw or something, and on the turn we hit a backdoor flush draw, we turn a gut shot or something. We can think about check raise bluffing the turn because this is how we play our sets on the turn. As mentioned, we can also think about donk betting as a bluff. Checking the turn is especially effective when we know that our opponent has a high turn barrel frequency. The other situation where we think about check calling a flop is, as mentioned, on a drawy texture. And since we're going to have some pairs in our check calling range, it's also a good idea to put some draws and some other hands in our check calling range. And what we generally do is, let's say we decided to check call a flush draw on a drawy texture. Let's say we make our draw on the turn. We think about going for a check raise, or if we check call the flop with some kind of straight draw and we make our straight on the turn, then often we go for a check raise. So the same thing we can do when a potential draw completes on the turn, even if it's not necessarily our draw. For example, we might check call a flop with a straight draw and a potential flush draw gets there on the turn. Even though we don't actually have the flush, it's certainly going to be in our check calling range. We can think about bluffing in that spot and going for a check raise. It may not work so well if the turn card is a blank, i.e. the flop texture is very drawy. Our check calling range is very often going to be pairs and draws. Then the turn cards are blank. doesn't really improve our check calling range that much, so it's going to start looking strange if you want to end up going for a check raise. It does of course depend if you are defending on a drawy texture with some strong hands. For example, if you decide that you want to protect your range and check call something like pocket jacks on the jack 9-7 with a flush draw, then of course you can potentially also have a turn check raising range even on a blank turn card. In which case, as part of an overall game plan, you could also incorporate some check raise bluffs on the blank turn card also. But just keep in mind, from your opponent's point of view, it may look like you don't really have any hands when you do this, because you wouldn't necessarily check call a set on a drawy texture in most cases. So on a blank turn card, you're pretty capped, so it looks suspicious if you decide to go for a check raise. It actually looks like you have some kind of draw that you're turning into a bluff. So there are two categories of hands that are good to check raise as a bluff on the turn. The first category is hands that are a little bit too weak to call the second barrel, however they have nut potential. So we're talking about things like the nut gut shot, flush draws, that kind of thing. They can make a strong 5-card hand by the river, a pretty good hand to check raise. But it's also okay to check raise hands that don't have very good potential to improve, but may actually be the best hand against some of our opponent's draws. Because what can sometimes happen is our opponent calls our check raise, so our bluff fails, but then the river just ends up going check check and he has a busted draw. So this works especially well in two situations. Either our opponent is passive and he's not going to bluff if we check the river to him out of position, or simply that we are just in position ourselves, which doesn't apply in the context of this video. But it's much easier to see a free showdown even against an aggressive opponent if we have position, because after we raise the turn, he's usually going to check the river to us. We can just check back when our bluff fails, and some of the time we'll actually have the best hand against any of his busted draws that he called the turn raise with. Similar principles apply to when we were check raising the flop and thinking about whether to barrel the turn and river. If we decide that our opponent would certainly 3-bet his strongest holdings on the turn, then it may be a good spot to barrel the river, because we can identify that his turn range is capped when he doesn't re-raise us after we check raise him. The final line we're going to consider is simply calling down with made hands. So when is a hand strong enough to call 1-bet? When is it strong enough to call 2 or 3? So here's a very rough guide for the answer to that question. It's not always true, there are exceptions to every rule, but this is what I recommend as a good starting point against an unknown opponent. The hands which are strong enough to call 3 at the lower limits, mainly we should be calling 2-pair plus. Sometimes top pair, top kicker, but actually in most cases, if we're calling down 3 barrels with a 1-pair hand, it will probably be a losing play. It does depend on the opponent, of course, and the board texture, etc. But for the most part, the range it should be calling down 3 streets is 2-pair plus. Calling 2 streets can be all top pair hands, and the best second pair hands can call 2 streets. And the less vulnerable, weaker pairs can call 1 street and then fold the turn. If the hands are very vulnerable, you might want to think about turning them into a bluff by check raising if the texture is drawy, or you can simply fold very vulnerable pairs in some cases. So if you have something like pocket 2s on the king jack 9 with a flush draw, then don't feel bad about check folding even though you have a pair. So now, in no particular order, we're just going to consider some hands that have been played when defending from the blinds. So decide what you do in each situation and then compare it to what I'm doing. So here we have a7 offsuit. This is a hand you should be defending from the big blind. It's a hand that 5 years ago no one defended really, whereas it's definitely a hand you should be defending. So you make a cold call here from the big blind. The flop comes ace-5-3. So think about what your plan is on this texture. Pause the video if you like. So definitely we're going to be check calling, probably 2 streets at least, because as we saw, this kind of hand, one of the weaker top pair hands, should be strong enough to check call twice and then think about folding to a 3rd barrel. Here on the river, it's actually pretty close because it's not necessarily a great card for us. It's good in that it's slightly less likely he has an ace, but we don't necessarily improve that much relative to his range. So if he 3 barrels, a lot of the time it's actually going to be a better ace or something like pocket 3s, 5s. So even though it improves the absolute strength of a hand on the river, it doesn't improve the relative strength of a hand that much. The only good thing to say is there's 1 less ace he can have in his range. And he just checks back, which is good for us. So this hand's played fine. Okay, next hand. We have 7-9 suited. This should be a very standard defend from the big blind, so we want to really expand our defending range in this particular spot. We can see here we have a flush draw. Flush draws are generally hands that you can put in both your check raising and check calling range, so either would be an okay option here. We notice the flop is Queen 10-5, two-tone, so it's definitely a board we can think about check raising. Definitely a drawy texture. So I go for a check raise, which is fine. Usually when you check raise with a flush draw, your intention should be to barrel most turn cards, just because you have a lot of equity. If we'd raised, for example, here with a backdoor, let's say we had something like ace-4 of spades, and we turned our spade, we'd almost definitely barrel. So the fact that we already have a flush draw means that we should just fire most turn cards in this particular spot. So our opponent just folds here, which is fine, and you'll find that you get a lot of folds in this spot because your opponent's opening a wide range from the button. It's quite difficult for him to stand up to a lot of check raises here, which is why it's such a good strategy basically. Check calling down passively is not quite so good. For example, this guy may have just c-bet ace high here and actually has the best hand. And if we just check call down, we may actually end up losing at showdown. There's a possibility. So taking the aggressive option is definitely very good here. Next hand, we have Queen King. Should definitely be a standard defend against a cutoff open here. Don't necessarily need to 3-bet here. Calling is completely fine. We notice here that the texture is not that drawy. However, we do have overcards and a backdoor, so we should think about putting this in our defending range. Probably fine just to check call on this texture because the board is not that drawy. This is one of those spots where the turn card hasn't improved us. We obviously cannot check call again in this particular spot. However, our hand does still have some potential because we do still have 2 live overcards. We may actually have the best hand. It's not impossible our opponent has something like Queen Jack, Jack 9, for example. So those things combined, it's actually a pretty good spot to donk bet the turn because we can't check call, but our hand still has some potential. So we should be able to donk bet the turn here and take the pot down. Queen 10 in the big blinds. Cutoff opens. Let's just double check his sizing. 3 big blinds, so it's perfectly okay to call here from the big blind. Again, 5 years ago this would be a very loose call. We notice here the flop texture is that two-tone, somewhat drawy texture. So we should probably think about going for a check raise here. We could think about check calling. Our draw is a lot weaker in this particular case since there are 2 spades out there. So some of our outs, the king of spades and the 8 of spades, are tainted. So it can be a good idea to turn these weaker draws into bluffs. So check raising is usually going to be the best option here. Check raise sizing should be roughly 3 times the opponent's c-bet sizing as a rough guide. And our opponent folds here, which is a perfectly good outcome for us. 5-4 offsuit, button min raises. So this is a somewhat loose defend, but against a min raise you should be defending very, very wide. So it's not actually as loose as it may first seem. And keep in mind, we're not doing it because we think our 5 high is good. We're doing it because we think we can take our opponent off his wide range post flop. We flop top pair here. We should definitely be able to check call 2 streets in this particular case. But firstly, let's see how the turn situation develops. So pretty standard check call here. The board texture is reasonably dry despite the fact that there's a flush draw out there. Low boards hit people less hard in general. Plus the board is paired as well. So an 8 here on the turn. We could certainly think about check calling twice. It's certainly a reasonable option. However, we could also categorize this hand as being one that doesn't play as well as a check call. The reason for this is that there are lots of bad river cards for us. It's also going to be difficult for us to continue calling down if our opponent does decide to 3-barrel, etc. He can still bluff us off our hand here. So for that reason, we have a hand that has potential, but it's not necessarily the greatest hand to check call. So while it's okay to check call, would be a perfectly okay line. We can also think about turning a hand into a bluff here. And when I say bluff, I mean the term very loosely because in a lot of ways this is more of a protection bet than a bluff. There's a very good chance that our 5 high is good, but we don't necessarily want our opponent to see a free river, so it's fine just to lead the turn here for protection. It's actually a pretty strong line. Here we have King Jack offsuit in the big blind. Should be a very standard defend versus a 2.5x open. This particular flop, we should be able to check call. This is actually a pretty drawy texture, but as mentioned, we are going to have some kind of check calling range in this texture that is going to involve some of the stronger second pair hands. Hand is probably a little bit too strong to think about check raising, but certainly if we had bottom pair with a backdoor draw, perhaps if we had something like ace 9 of diamonds, we might decide to turn the hand into a bluff by check raising rather than check calling. King Jack with a gut shot should be strong enough to check call on this board. Turn comes an ace, so I think this is actually a reasonable spot to check raise as a bluff. Just turn our hand into a bluff here, because when our opponent two barrels, there's a decent chance we're behind his range. However, this ace does connect with some of our potential check calling range on the flop. We can certainly have some stuff like ace 9, ace jack. If this ace had improved us to some straights, then I would almost definitely go for a check raise. The problem is that this ace doesn't actually make any straights, because if we have the king 10, we already had the straight on the flop. So I think the other option besides check raising is simply to check fold, because we now have a third pair hand that shouldn't really be strong enough to check call twice. So while check raising is an option, I think check folding is probably going to be the best here in the long run. Also, we look at our opponent's bet sizing here. We bet pot size, so this is usually a pretty big tail. Can of course connect with his range as well. He can still have things like sets, king 10, and basically most two pair combos, given that he opens the button. So it's probably going to be a good spot just to check fold here on the turn. Pocket eights, standard defend from the big blind versus the button open. We have a second pair type hand, so we definitely should be check calling at least once. We don't really want to be check raising on a jack 5-2 board because it's pretty dry, so check calling is going to be the best option here. This is a good spot where we could think about check raising, not because our hand has good potential to improve on the river, but because our hand is still reasonably chanced that our hand is good here. In fact, our opponent probably doesn't two barrel most of his jack X hands here for value, so unless he specifically has some kind of queen or he already has a set, then we actually may have the best hand here when he decides to two barrel. So against a passive opponent, what can happen here is that we check raise, and he either folds if he's two barreling because he thinks it's a good bluff card, or he calls us with some type of turn flush draw, gut shot, or straight draw. And then if he's passive, he ends up just checking back the river, and our pocket eights is actually good on the river. It works especially well against passive opponents. If you're going to check raise, your opponent's going to call with a draw, then when you check the river he's going to bluff, then it doesn't work so well, because you're basically not going to have that additional expectation due to the fact that you have some kind of showdown hand here. However, in a vacuum, it can still be profitable just to check raise. And of course, we don't necessarily have to check the river. If we think the river is a especially good card, we can think about firing the river as a bluff also. 9-10 offsuit from the big blind should be reasonably okay to defend in this particular spot, especially with the smaller sizing. We might fall against a 3x open. King 7-8, as mentioned, our draw is not quite as good due to the fact that some of our diamond outs are tainted. 6 of diamonds, jack of diamonds, not the greatest cards, although we do have the backdoor draw as well, so we do have a redraw to diamonds. So check raising can be good. Check calling still fine though, nothing completely wrong with check calling, but check raising might be a slightly stronger option in this case. We decide to check call, which is okay. And this 8 can potentially connect with our range. The reason it can is because we can certainly have things like ace 8, 8-9, etc. in our defending range, and we'd actually very likely check call these hands because they're a second pair type hand. Doesn't really make sense to check raise something like 10-8 suited, 8-9 suited, so we can certainly have some 8x holdings here. So for that reason, it's an okay spot to go for a check raise bluff on the turn and hope our opponent folds, which is what happens in this case. Jack 10 offsuit, we're defending 9-10 offsuit. We should obviously defend Jack 10, especially against a min raise. We have a gut shot here on a two-tone board with somewhat drawy. Should be a pretty good spot to go for a check raise here. Hope our opponent folds, which he does. King 4. This is a somewhat borderline defend. You don't have to defend suited King 4 in this particular spot. On this texture, we could certainly go for a check call. Our pair is weak enough that we could think about going for a check raise also. That would certainly be a reasonable option here. But check calling is also fine in this particular case. Our opponent calls. The thing about his range somewhat here. And the question is, would he 3-bet 8s, 4s or 2s on the flop? There's certainly a chance he may do. However, he's also going to have things like some 8x hands, some things like pocket 6s, for example. He can have some flush draws. He'll have pocket 9s, pocket 10s. He may even have some floats in his range. So it's a reasonable card to barrel here. We also have 5 outs to improve on the river where we can bet for value. Any king of 4 is usually going to be an okay hand. So it's a fine spot just to barrel after we check raise there. If in doubt, usually overcards are good cards to barrel. So if you're not completely sure which cards hit your range, your opponent's range, etc., then if the turn's an overcard, then it's usually going to be okay to barrel. Queen 8 offsuit. Our opponent makes 2.5x, so it is actually okay to defend here. We flop a second pair type hand, so usually it's going to go in our check calling range. It's going to be a little bit too strong to check raise here. The turn is a blank, and our opponent bets again. So it's a second pair type hand. It's close between a check call and a check fold. I'd probably just think about check folding here versus a second barrel. Wouldn't be terrible to check call. Depends on your opponent, of course, as well. Queen 9 suited, very standard defend in this particular spot. We flop top pair, so we want to at least be check calling 2 streets. In this particular case, I think I decided to turn the hand into a bluff, which is okay. It's a bit of an overpowered bluff. You could certainly just check call twice here. But it would be very difficult to call the river, and one advantage to bluffing with this type of hand is we may again get called by worse. Even though we're not check raising for value, we may still get called by king 10, ace king, ace 10, flush draws, 8-9, etc. So if our opponent is passive, it can be pretty profitable because he'll just check back the river with his busted draw. So turn check raise sizing is a little bit smaller than the flop check raise sizing. Turn is just over 2 times the c-bet sizing on the turn, whereas on the flop it's closer to 3 times. Our opponent calls in this particular case. So we just check here, and we hope he has some kind of busted draw and he checks back. That would be the perfect outcome for us here. Let's see what he has. He has Queen Jack, so he had the best hand in this particular case. But notice how it caused him to play passively, facing that check raise. He doesn't even bet the river for value when he has top 2 pair in this particular case. Okay, last hand, King 10 offsuit, pretty standard defend from the big blind. We flop a drawy texture, 9-8-2, so reasonably drawy. So we should immediately be thinking about, can we check raise this board? We have overcards, we have backdoor straight, we have a backdoor flush, even though it's not the greatest backdoor flush, so it should be an okay spot to go for a check raise here. Our opponent calls. 9-8-2 is probably the kind of texture where our opponent would very likely 3-bet. If he has pocket 9s, pocket 8s, he'd probably 3-bet. So at this stage, his range is going to be flush draws, some 9x hands, some overpair hands. He probably doesn't have too many aces in his range unless he specifically has an ace-x of spades for a flush draw, or he has something like ace-9, ace-8, which is now improved to 2-pair. And he's obviously not going to fold these hands to a second barrel on the turn. However, the rest of his range is in a tough spot. He has some straight draws, some flush draws, some 9x, some 8x hands, some overpairs. A lot of these are going to struggle facing a reasonably sized bet on the turn. So it's definitely fine to 2-barrel here and hope our opponent folds. So this is one spot where our opponent does have some strong hands, like he can have ace-9, ace-8, but for the most part he's actually pretty capped on this turn card. He doesn't have things like pocket 9s, pocket 8s, etc. He has lots of 1-pair hands and draws. So it's a good spot to put a lot of pressure on him, especially on this turn card, where we can put additional pressure on stuff like pocket 10s, because he's worried we're check raising some kind of ace-x hand on the flop. Okay, so hopefully after watching this video you should have a better idea of how to defend post-flop when cold calling from the blinds. So keep in mind the two main things that players are doing incorrectly is firstly they're not defending enough from the big blind versus a late position open. And then the second thing they're doing is they're playing too passively post-flop, they're not playing back frequently enough. So it's important to be quite aggressive with your check raising and your floating post-flop to try and exploit the fact that the late position opener very frequently will have a wide range. Okay, so thanks very much for watching. Please leave any comments and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Thanks for watching. This has been Weasel for PokerVIP.com.